It's like smelling salts. It is good to be here with you. Thank you so much for coming to this, for the second part of our documentary and discussion. Again, my name's Garrett Santner. I'm the pastor here at Linwood. And just an effort of housekeeping, there are bathrooms out these doors and to your left over here. And I see some people are sitting over here. That's great, because last week the sun was hitting this. I don't think we'll have that much of an issue. But if you need to moving to over there might be better to be able to view the screens better. That's all I have, and I'm going to turn it over to Kyle.
Good evening, Kyle Delhagen. I'm the pastor at Hamilton Union Presbyterian Church. It is good for us to be together tonight. Just a little brief commercial for a book study that is coming up on Blood Brothers, about a Palestinian Christian working for peace in the Holy Land. My wife, who wishes she could be here tonight, but she's got a really bad cold, she will be leading it. Right now, we are just gauging interest and availabilities. No times have been set yet, but there is a sign-up sheet in the back with the image of the book, and just sign up, put your name, email address, and best evenings, days, times, all of that you would be able to meet for that, and whether in person or Zoom would be better for you. So again, no decisions have been made about meetings, but we're just collecting names and information at this point. Probably at this time, we are in the season of let's circle back around to that next year. So probably after Christmas. I cannot see any of us getting anything together before then, but January, so yeah.
And I'm Ostricht. I'm the pastor at Altamont in Helderberg. So today, last week's film was further history. It was over 100 years ago, and so history gives a certain sense of comfort with the distance. The film today, however, is contemporary, which can give a different experience a little bit. And so I just kind of wanted to just give a little bit of some of the overview, a little bit of what I gave last time, but it's important to have some categories in mind. Ethnicity is kind of your background, kind of your blood relationship, right? And so when it comes to ethnicity, we're talking about here are Jews and Arabs. Arabs are both Muslim and Christian. And so religion is a different category. There are ethnic Jews who are not religious Jews. There are also religious Jews who are not ethnic Jews. And that's where this conversation kind of muddies a little bit as well. But I also want to talk clearly about what we're doing and what we're not doing here. What we're not doing here are trying to allow for or inflame hatred, anger, prejudice against Jews, against Muslims, against. The world has enough hate and fear, and we don't need to add to that. What we are trying to do is seek to grow in our understanding and seek to grow in our compassion. Truth is often messy. We like simple ways of right and wrong and good and bad, but truth is often messy, and that's the case here as well. And so we'll have some time for discussion afterwards as we seek to grow in our understanding together. But if there are certain points in the film that you find yourself getting uncomfortable, ask yourself why that might be, because that can often communicate important things to us as well. So hold on to that, and then we'll talk more afterwards. So, perfect.
I want to invite us all to take a breath. And another one. Move your body, because If, like me, you've been sitting here just incredibly tense for the past almost 2 hours, we need to just move. Brief 1 or 2 word responses to what we just watched. Very depressing. Sadness. Enlightening. That's really. I'm sorry? What are they thinking? What can be done? Well, we've got somebody with us tonight who can, I don't know, John, do you have any answers? So a lot of what this movie focuses in on is in the West Bank. A lot of what's going on in the world now is taking place in Gaza. Reverend John Parlberg is here, and we were hoping if you could just share a little bit about Gaza and that particular context and situation, and then we'll open up for some questions and some time of conversation.
Yeah, a lot is happening in Gaza, obviously. It's in the news, but many things are happening in the West Bank as well. Less in the news, but a lot of oppression and violence happening in the West Bank. I have been to the West Bank, I think 5 times with different groups. The last one was led by Joshua. So I have some experience there. I have never been to Gaza. But maybe just a little background on some of the history in Gaza. As the documentary film pointed out, Israel gained control of Gaza in 1967 after the 67 war. But in 2005, decided to disengage from Gaza. Removed the settlers, the Jewish settlements in Gaza, and the military. There was, you may remember that, there was resistance by the settlers, but they were forced to leave Gaza in 2005. A year later, there was to be an election, a Palestinian election, and encouraged to have that election by the U.S. President Bush was the president at the time. And much to the U.S.'s surprise and Israel's surprise, Hamas won the election. It was between Hamas and Fatah, which was the party of Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian Authority. So Hamas won the election. It was deemed free and fair. In fact, the United States congratulated the Palestinian people on a free and fair election. But tensions between Hamas and Fatah continued, sometimes violently, and Hamas kicked out what remained of Fatah in Gaza. Hamas took control of Gaza. Fatah had the control of the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority. So you have 2 Palestinian groups governing 2 parts of the Palestinian territory. Hamas refused to renounce violence, and as a result of that, in 2007, Israel imposed a blockade on Gaza. Israel had all the control of what went into Gaza, what came out of Gaza, food, fuel, goods, people. And Gaza is only about 140 square miles, about 20 miles long, 7 miles wide, and home to, 2 million people, 2.5 million people, one of the most populated, heavily populated areas on Earth. So that blockade has continued since 2007. People have called Gaza an open-air prison. And then, skirmishes between Hamas and Israel have been on and off, Hamas firing rockets into southern Israel, Israel responding. And then in October of this year, the horrific attack by Hamas on civilians and Israel's response. So that's some of the background. Some 1,200 Israelis were killed in that attack on October 7. In Israel's response, now about 10 times that many people have been killed in Gaza, and nearly half of them, 40% of them, children. And that's continuing. There's now pretty much a communication blockade because power has been cut off. So it's hard to know exactly what's happening in Gaza, but the attacks are continuing, including the recent attacks on the hospital. I don't know where to go with this. If you want to talk about what we can do as Christians, as a church, or other kinds of questions. Yeah.
Do you know why Israel decided to take the Jewish settlements out of Gaza?
Yeah, the question is what made the Israeli government decide to disengage from Gaza? And I'm not sure of the history of that. I think there was some negotiation pressure from probably other countries. There were also a couple settlements removed from the West Bank at that time. Ariel Sharon was the prime minister at the time. But I don't know the full answer to that question. Yes.
What has been the international response or reaction to some of the terrorism that we saw occurring in the West Bank during this film? Is that addressed at all?
The international response to the occupation and the Israeli oppression of Palestinians? In the United States and in Western Europe, especially the U.S., there's been great sympathy for the Israeli narrative. And there's good reason for that. People have suffered terribly under the Holocaust and centuries of persecution finally have a homeland where they're supposedly free and secure. But as people are becoming more and more aware of what is happening in the West Bank, there's been some pressure, especially the continuing Israeli settlements, UN resolutions opposing the settlements and so forth. Most of those resolutions have been vetoed by the United States. And just recently, President Biden said our support for Israel is unequivocal, unqualified. So the United States has been a big supporter of Israel. I think, some of that is beginning to change as people become more aware of the situation. Yes?
There's been some talk about a two-state situation. I, on the other hand, have friends who, one friend describes herself as a Zionist, and that any kind of dialogue or communication that would end up with a two-state situation is totally unacceptable and totally for this person, it would be the most fearful thing imaginable because of, and then looking back at the Holocaust. So I know that your position here, I believe I'm correct. You're our point person for peace with churches, Middle East church peace. I find that not only am I brought to my knees, which is a good thing, I guess, but I have no words whatsoever at this point in order to have any kind of a dialogue. So there's the dilemma.
Yeah, the question about a two-state solution, and you know, I think it's important to recognize those of us who have not experienced the Holocaust or have ancestors who have been through the Holocaust, we can't fully fathom what it felt like to those people when Hamas made this latest horrific attack. You know, their life was threatened, their whole history is threatened. So we need to acknowledge that kind of trauma that's behind this. And as far as a two-state solution, you know, that's the official policy of the U.S. to press for a two-state solution. But the Israeli Knesset some years ago passed I don't know if it's called a nation-state law, which basically said that Israel is the home of the Jewish people exclusively. Everybody who lives in Israel has human rights, but national rights belong only to the Jewish people. And back in 1997, or 1977 maybe, the Likud party platform, which is the platform of Benjamin Netanyahu, stated that from the sea to the river must be under Jewish Israeli sovereignty only. And that's their party platform. You've heard the slogans maybe at some of the recent rallies, and what, who was it that got in trouble for saying, from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free. Again, Israelis hear that as a threat to their existence. I don't think it has to be interpreted that way, but we need to understand that's how it's heard. But that's not, that thinking isn't exclusive to Palestinians. It's part of the official party platform of the Likud party that from the river to the sea, Israel must be sovereign. So that's what we're dealing with, how to get a two-state solution out of that. Others have said that a two-state solution is now passed. There are, what, 700,000 Israelis living in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem. How do you make that a viable state? And instead, there should be some kind of one-state solution or a confederation where there are rights both for Palestinians and Israelis living in the area.
One of the things that I appreciate about this documentary is that we heard from both Palestinians and Israelis in it, although it didn't identify who it was, who was who. We kind of figured out kind of who was who. But I think one of the things that is important for us to remember as well is that just like Palestinians are not a monolith, neither are Israelis. And here we saw a number of Israelis who are in opposition to the position of their government. And just like we, depending upon your political affiliation, you may not feel like you represent your government. Israelis don't necessarily all represent their government either. And I think this is the biggest thing that's important for us to remember is that Israel and Israelis are not a monolith. And not all Jewish people are Israelis. Not all Israelis are Jewish, and the state of Israel does not speak for all Israelis. It certainly doesn't speak for all Jewish folks. And so I think it's that thing is that fine piece that we've kind of gotten caught into is that any criticism of the policies of the state of Israel equal anti-Semitism, which isn't the case. Anti-Semitism is bad. Full stop. And there is a difference between Jewish people and the state of Israel, and I think that's an important distinction to make in our minds as we think about what the future might look like. So, anyways, I just wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that's very important because especially recently, people have been just taking sides, black and white. If you condemn Hamas, some people say, well, you're supporting Israel, and that's not the case. And if you condemn Israel's response, you're saying, well, you're condemning the Palestinians, and that's not the case. So we need to recognize that it's a much more nuanced situation. I would like to say a couple of things about possible responses, practical things that we can do. One is doing what you're doing this evening, just becoming more aware, learning more aware, learning more about the situation. And one good resource for that is Churches for Middle East Peace. And their website is cmep.org. CMEP, Churches for Middle East Peace.org. And they have a wealth of information and resources and up-to-date information, including giving daily briefings about what's happening. Another thing is the part of the film with Gerard Horton on what's happening with children in the West Bank. 3, 4, 5 years ago, there was legislation introduced in the U.S. Congress. Shorthand is the Defense of Human Rights of Palestinian Children and Families. But it said that any U.S. aid, any U.S. military aid to Israel, the Secretary of State has to guarantee that it's not being used to abuse human rights or to imprison and arrest children. The U.S. gives $10 million a day, $10 million a day in military aid to Israel. That's before October 7. So this would condition that aid in a sense, saying that you have to guarantee it's not being used to abuse children and arrest children. That's been introduced year after year after year for 4 or 5 years. Several of us have been lobbying our Congressman, Paul Tonko, meeting with him, meeting with his aides, writing letters, sending petitions. And finally, a year or so ago, he agreed to be a co-sponsor of that legislation, and we have to thank him for that. But I just want to say, persistence and patience and keeping at it sometimes can make a difference. There's also a piece of legislation, a resolution before the House calling for an immediate ceasefire in Israel. Most church bodies, including the Reformed Church, Church for Middle East Peace, have advocated for a ceasefire. There was a recent letter from 30 heads of communions, churches advocating for a ceasefire. That's another thing we can do is call our representatives, in my case again, Paul Tonko, and urge him to be a supporter of that resolution calling for a ceasefire. So far, he has declined to do that. But again, I think if he hears from more people, more persistence, just keep at it, that can make a difference.
You had mentioned the site to go to, Christians for Peace, or Christians of the Middle of the...
Churches for Middle East Peace. The Reformed Church also has a member on the board of that organization.
My question is, just a dialogue with the Christian churches?
Churches for Middle East Peace is a coalition of Christian churches, but they are in dialogue and encourage dialogue with both Muslims and Jews.
So, Josh Viss, who is one of the gentlemen on the documentary, he's led lots of trips to Israel and Palestine, and he has good information on the website. He also, at joshviss.com, has information about stuff him and Matt DeBlay are doing. So good resources to check out. And I know that I've looked on there, and he has some updates about things going on, just in case you wanted more information and want to check things out.
We had the opportunity of going to Israel with Josh's parents, and what is shown there is absolutely true. What Israel is doing is despicable. What Hamas has done is despicable. There is a little bit of difference between Hamas and what's going on in the West Bank, but the intractable thing is that the Palestinians want Israel out completely. And Israel wants Palestinians out completely. And until those hearts change, until there's a willingness to try and get along, it's not going to change. And that's what we've got to pray for. Some willingness to back down and try and get along in the same land. But right now, those in charge want the others out completely. And that's just the root of the problem. And there's all the other stuff is making that worse. You know, it's what each other tries to do to get the other out.
Yeah, I think the journalist in the film said nothing is going to change unless there's pressure. And you know, we need a change in Israeli leadership, a change in Palestinian leadership, and a change in U.S. policy. Because the U.S. can exert some influence and, you know, change some of the policy, but and that's where we come in, I think, in being advocates for a change in policy. Yes.
You said Hamas had free and fair elections back in 2005 or so. Are they still having elections?
No, the Palestinian Authority has not had elections in years, and it's not well respected by most of the Palestinians. Mahmoud Abbas is the, I don't know, president, what the title is, but they're viewed as corrupt and basically, in many cases, agents of the, as it was said in the film, Israel military. So a new Palestinian leadership is necessary. One person who's been mentioned is Marwan Barghouti, has been called the Palestinian Mandela. He's currently in prison. You know, how this is going to happen, if it happens, I don't know. But no, there haven't been elections, free elections, in a long time.
And I just want to mention too, on that point, is that Hamas, if I remember right, won a very slim plurality in that election. And then what they did is then they kicked out the other party, right? And so the election that they were voting for didn't exactly turn out how it was, or it didn't turn out how it was intended, because won a bare plurality, and then they kick out the other people. And so I think, so they have to have elections now, but even the elections that they voted for didn't turn out quite how it was intended.
Yeah.
So is the Israeli government representative of the Israeli people, or is it kind of like China, where the People's Republic of China, the Communist Party, is only really representing about 7% of China's population.
Is which government?
The Israeli government.
Is Israeli government? Is the Israeli government representative of the people? Before the October 7 attack by Hamas, there obviously a lot of division in Israeli society. Netanyahu was elected, but there's, several parties. They have to form a coalition in Israel to have a government. So is it representative? Yes and no. There's a lot of opposition to Netanyahu, but with this attack, as you can readily understand, most Israelis came together and say, we've got to fight this, and we've got to put aside our internal differences, at least for a while.
If you go back to 1947, what was the rationale for giving the Palestinians roughly 45%, or offering them roughly 45% of the land while they occupied 60, or they represented 65% of the population? And had that been done differently, might things be different today?
A good question. I don't know what the rationale was. If things had turned out differently, if the Palestinians had agreed to say, okay, we'll live with, 45% of the land, that would still be more than they have today. But that's hindsight.
Are you familiar with Father
Yeah.
school that I know existed 25 years ago? Because
Elias Shakur?
pardon me?
Yeah.
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 So
Yeah, I've met
do you
him.
know if there is any attempt in the Middle East that would be analogous to what he was able to do with having a school that included Arabs, Israelis, Palestinians?
Yeah, there are organizations in Israel where Palestinians and Israelis are together. Helping Hand School is one. There's also an organization called Parent Circle, where Israeli and Palestinian parents who have lost children in the violence have come together to share their grief and to work for peace. So there are those organizations working at dialogue between Palestinians and Israelis. And it's very important because Israeli policy is to try to keep the people separate, not to have them interact. So those kinds of efforts are important. I do think we need to be careful in thinking that that's the only solution. That if people could just get along, then there wouldn't be this problem. And while that's helpful, unless it addresses the underlying problem and injustice of the occupation, just being friends and then going back to living under that oppression is not going to solve the problem. In South Africa, the church wrote the Kairos document, and in it they said that reconciliation without justice is a false reconciliation. So we need to keep those kind of dialogues going and helping people understand each other, including here. But we also can't neglect the underlying injustice of the occupation and have to address that as well.
For what it's worth, looking at the 47 map that was drawn, a fair amount of Israel was the Sinai, which is among the least populated area around. So, for what it's worth, that isn't a very good part of Israel.
Yeah, well, I don't think, you said the Sinai?
Sinai.
I think it was the Negev, right? The southern part.
I'm sorry, Negev, yes. Yeah. but it's still desert.
Yeah.
You know, and so,
Yeah.
who wants to live there very much?
Question here.
I just want to invite everybody to think about the dangers of what was mentioned about what's the narrative being taught in Israeli schools to the children, and then they grow up with this narrative of history, and all of them must serve in the military. And that narrative is also shown to us in the West, you know, when we go on these tourism trips in the places that we're allowed to see and the places that we're ushered away from. But also there's an American and Israeli, I don't remember the exact name for it, but a team that is specifically meant to spread propaganda throughout the world of what narrative is true, and it is made up of Israeli and American powers.
So if Israel were to stop occupying, say, the West Bank, where would it go, I guess? Yeah, I guess assuming, like, if you didn't have a two-state solution, you know, does any other country, like Jordan or, you know, yeah, who would control it?
If the occupation, if Israel ended the occupation, who would be in charge? That's a very good question. You know, the thought is a separate and independent Palestinian state. But there's never been a Palestinian state. They've always been occupied from the 1400s by the Ottoman Empire, and then the British, and now Israel. So they don't have a history of governing themselves, and the occupation has made that more difficult as Israel, you know, tries to fragment the society. So they would need a lot of help and encouragement. I don't know if it would be the UN or other Arab countries. But yeah, that's a very tough question, I think.
Easy question. What year was this video? Do you know?
Easy question to which I do not know the answer. 3-4 years ago? Yeah, it's not. It's fairly recent.
I am certainly not an expert on the Middle East at all, but I found an interesting comment when the gate to out of Gaza to Egypt was closed. It wasn't closed by Israel. It wasn't closed by the Palestinians. It was closed by Egypt. And I found that fascinating because, okay, and the comment that I was attributed to the leadership of Egypt was, we don't want them here. And it was, we don't want the situation that you're experiencing there in that area to come here. Right? And I went, okay. My question was, why? That was my initial question at that comment. That puts a new light on things for me. So the Middle East is not quite open to the Palestinians themselves, other countries in the Middle East. So I saw a sign, we were in New York recently, and where would the Palestinians go?
Yeah, there are some 2.5 million people in Gaza, and the fear is, and many of them who are in Gaza have been refugees or descendants of refugees from the 1948 and 1967 wars. And now the fear is they're being pushed out of Gaza into Egypt, and Egypt is reluctant to take in another couple million refugees. Where would they go? There are refugee camps in Jordan, in the West Bank, in Lebanon. How would the United States feel? Say, let's take in a couple million Palestinians. That we're not very open either. So I think that's the fear. How is Egypt going to deal with all these people? How to house them, feed them, find jobs, integrate them into society. And Palestinians are tired of being refugees. They want to live in their own homes, in their own land. I could say one more thing about how we respond. Just listening to the Palestinian story and sharing that story can be very, very important. I was speaking like this in a group some years ago and telling what my experience had been in Palestine. And unbeknownst to me, there was a young man from Palestine who was part of the audience. And after I was finished, he said, when people come to visit us and we tell our stories, we wonder, where do they go? What happens? Does anyone else hear them? He said, you have told our story, and we're so grateful. I think, just to know that they're not forgotten, even though the situation isn't changing, that they're not forgotten, that people are listening to their stories and sharing those stories can be very, very important means of encouraging and standing alongside people who are suffering. So continue to learn and continue to tell and share those stories.
Thank you so much, John, for being here, for sharing with us. Thank you all for coming. As John just said, this is important, and we need to continue to have these conversations, as uncomfortable as they may make us. You've given us a couple of practical things we can do, and tomorrow I will be calling my representatives. And I encourage you all to consider doing the same. Take care of yourselves tonight. We've watched some really heavy, emotionally, spiritually heavy stuff. Take care tonight. Rest, relax, drink water. Those are 3 really important things you can do. But I would like to close us in prayer. Gracious and loving God, you are a God who remembers. You are a God who sees and hears and holds all of our stories. Help us to hear, help us to listen, help us to learn. May we be voices for those who have been silenced. May we be hands and feet for those in need. Give us traveling mercies as we go home this evening, and give us rest so that we can wake up tomorrow ready to get back to work. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.